Con Sweeney. As you can tell from my attire, it's that time of year and we're celebrating it despite the pandemic. Merry Christmas. We're a monthly show based here on the Second Life Book Club here in Second Life. We broadcast live from here on Facebook and YouTube every third Monday of the month at 6 p.m. Second Life time or Pacific Life time for you folks in real life. We meet mystery authors and others from the publishing world to talk about books and the issues facing them today from social and technological change. And there's certainly been a lot of those lately. I'd like to thank Draxter Dupre, host of the Second Life Book Club and the Drax Files Radio Hour, both broadcast from Second Life, for his sponsorship and the use of the Book Club Island. I'd also like to thank Strawberry Linden and Brett Linden for their help in setting the show up. And finally, my eternal thanks to Becky Hansen and Isabel Charon for all their technical assistance in making this happen. Without you, it wouldn't have been possible. And a special thanks to Isabel for getting up at 1 a.m. her time to run the camera for us. Thank you, Isabel. Now, allow me to introduce this evening's guest, Bill Curatolo, Ph.D., who is author of Campanellismo and Too Many Hats, thrillers set in the pharmaceutical industry where Bill has spent much of his career. So, Bill, welcome to the show, and maybe you'd like to start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your journey to writing books.
Sure. First of all, I'm glad to be here, and Con, you must be taking hormone replacement therapy or something. I've never seen somebody grow a beard this quickly.
Well, you're from the drug industry. You ought to know.
Oh, I can do all sorts of things. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey, and a lot of the things that I've done through my life sort of end up in my books in one way or another. I'll just say, sometimes people think scientists can't write fiction, but a lot of it has to do with attitude, I think. But anyway, just to get started, I grew up in working class Queens in New York City. I think you're a Brooklyn boy, if I'm not mistaken.
You're right, working class Brooklyn.
Yeah, and I went to Catholic school, and the nuns taught me how to write. And if there's one thing I learned there, I learned the King's English. And I think that made me a good science writer. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I went to high school in Astoria, Queens. I went to college in the Bronx. It's very typical of people my age and my generation in New York City, from working class neighborhoods. My parents, I pretty much listened to what my parents wanted me to do. And, they said, well, you don't go away to college. That's a waste of money. Why would you go away to college? You just take the subway. So I took the subway up to Manhattan College in the Bronx, and I ended up majoring in electrical engineering. Not for any love of electrical engineering so much, but just because it seemed like something that would get me a job someday. Well, as happens to a lot of people, as that proceeded, I found a whole lot of other interests. And when I was in college, I played in a rock band. We were Doors wannabes, and a folk group. I actually played at the Bitter End in New York City a couple of times. But that sometimes I tell people that's where Peter, Paul, and Mary got their start, and that's where I got my finish, which is pretty much true. And I'm looking back, I'm really glad about this. I had lots of jobs. I was a mailman. I worked in a truck distribution center in Long Island City. That was what's called a shape-up job, where people stole stuff every night. I was a mail driver for IBM. I worked in the Hellgate power plant in the South Bronx. I was an industrial spy, which we can talk about at some point if that's what you'd like to.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, and that's true. I was a vegetable man at the A&P. I worked in the Shea Stadium parking lot, and I was an usher for rock concerts. And some of this stuff really colored what I wrote later on. Anyway, I won't bore you with all kinds of details, but I will say I never became an electrical engineer. I spent 1 year post-college in self-study of biology, and I worked full-time as a mail van driver. Then I went off to State University of New York at Binghamton, and then off to graduate school in Boston. I was in the biophysics division at the BU Medical School, and I became a lab jock. I really found what I really like to do in life, which is a lucky thing, you know. And I'm glad I didn't go off and head straight into something that I wouldn't have been happy with. But anyway, I worked on biological membrane structure, the myelin sheath around nerves, and I published my first scientific papers. Then I went on and I was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT in molecular biology for a couple of years, working with a Nobel laureate. And then I was research faculty at MIT at the National Magnet Lab for 4 years, one of the places where MRI imaging was developed. And again, I continued to work on the structure of the myelin sheath around nerve. The important thing with respect to tonight's discussion, I think, was I did a lot of scientific writing and publishing. I didn't do any fiction. But what I did do, starting really in graduate school, I started carrying around a little notebook, recording observations, things I heard on the radio. If I overheard conversations in the airport, people didn't know I was listening, of course. I would take notes. And I actually still do this today, although, you know, in pandemic time, I don't leave the house much. You know, I never knew what I was going to when or how I was going to use these things, but I just had the general idea that I might write stories someday. So briefly after that, I took a job at Pfizer in Connecticut in 1983. And that was one of the luckiest days of my life. You know, I'd always thought of myself as sort of a lifetime academic of the big university professor type with a large research lab full of graduate students and postdocs. But what shocked me was the amount of time and effort I was putting into writing grants while I was still at MIT. And I really started considering industry when Ronald Reagan froze the NIH budget. So I had great productive time at Pfizer, great colleagues, great facilities and support, great projects. And by the way, I'm proud of my alma mater, Pfizer, with having come up with this COVID vaccine. And I won't say what I worked on, but I collaborated with a lot of people in Bend, Oregon, and a small company out there. So I spent a lot of time out in Bend, Oregon, which is a beautiful place. I spent a lot of time in Sandwich, England, saw lots of Europe, visited Japan, Malaysia, Borneo, all for my job. And I did a lot of scientific writing. I published lots of science articles and reviews, gave lectures, and I obtained 36 U.S. patents. And then, of course, the most important thing was I got married, had daughters, and they led me into classical music. They both majored in viola performance.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I'm saying this is fascinating, Bill. I've known you now for maybe 3 years, and, you know, full disclosure, everyone out there, Bill and I are both members of the Mystery Writers of America, the New York chapter, where we met originally. And I know a lot about Bill's life, but I'm learning a lot more here this evening.
Yeah, I could even tell you about the industrial spy thing.
Please do.
Well, a guy from my neighborhood got me this job, and I was paid in cash. And I used to, this guy worked, I'm trying to think now, it was TWA. He worked for TWA, which doesn't exist anymore, Trans World Airlines. And they wanted to steal customers. In my case, from American Airlines. So I would spend a week. This is the old days. There was no security. You could just walk up to a gate. You could sit there. And I would spend a week at a time. Here's an example. Meeting every plane from Chicago that came in on American Airlines. And I remember at the time they had a flight from Chicago to JFK every hour and a half hour or something like that. And I would count the number of men, women, and children coming off the plane. And at the end of the week, I would turn in a chart which listed every flight and how many men, women, and children got off that flight, so that TWA could steal some of that business, and they would know when to schedule their flights, because the airlines didn't trade this information.
Wow, it just you know, in a world of, you know, big data analytics, the internet being everywhere, you know, to go back to a much simpler time. I too can remember that time when you could walk into an airport, go right up to the gate, sit down, wait for somebody to arrive on an incoming flight, or just hang out. As a kid, my parents used to take us out to, I'm dating myself, Idlewild, is what we used to call Kennedy in the old days.
Oh, yeah.
And we would get dressed up on a Sunday afternoon and go out to the airport and look at the planes and wander around, and it was a different world.
Yeah, yeah, and I could have been. I was counseled by the guy who hired me. I could have been thrown out of the airport, so because I had no business there. But so what I did was I kept a change of clothes in my car, and and halfway through the day I would change my clothes, and sometimes I'd wear sunglasses. And I also knew where all the free food was at Kennedy Airport, so.
I'll bet you that in those days nobody really cared. As long as you didn't start a fight or start snoring, nobody cared.
Right, yeah, I never had any problem.
Yeah, that's good. So Bill, what made you start thinking about making the decision to go from scientific writing to writing mysteries?
As I said, I had this book that I always carried around with me, where I would make notes, and I just had this vague idea that someday I would do something, but it really was a vague idea. It was sort of a pipe dream. I never really tried. And then about 3 years before I left Pfizer, I left Pfizer in 2010. I had heard some stories that were interesting enough to me that I started to write them down in the form of fiction chapters. They were very loosely related. Started to get into a consistent, interesting story once I chose some main characters and decided what they would be like. But I was just doing this sort of haphazardly. And I left Pfizer in 2010, and then I worked as a consultant for a few years, and much of this was as an expert witness in patent trials. That's a whole other story. But I was on planes and trains a lot, and that's when I did a lot of writing. And that's when I finished my first book, Campanellismo. I really enjoyed doing that. I had heard, especially working in the drug industry for 27 years, you hear stories that sort of surprise you. I was aware of a situation where a small company had run clinical trials down in Costa Rica for a drug, and the whole thing got messed up because, actually, a friend of mine who worked at Pfizer was considering he was a clinician, a physician, and he was assigned to go down and look at the clinical data for this trial that this small company had run, and it turned out that the people who had run this trial had made up a lot of data. I can't remember the exact names, but the story was incredible. He said that he went to the hospital where the data was supposed to be, and they said, well, it's not here, but and he said, well, where is it? And they said, well, I think Dr. Lopez took it home. So he said, all right, let's go to Dr. Lopez's house. So they went to Dr. Lopez's house, and he didn't have the data, and it turns out it was all made up. So anyway, you hear these stories from time to time, and I just thought that you could put them together, and it might be interesting.
Well, it certainly is. And, for anyone who wants to try a different kind of mystery thriller, I would certainly recommend Bill's books. You don't get too many that come out of corporate America with this level of authenticity and detail that Bill has. But Bill, was it hard for you to write that first book? I know many writers who we meet here, they talk about that first book as kind of like a hill they have to get over and how difficult it is. You've been collecting material your entire career, it sounds. You had a lot of stuff that you could use. Was it hard, or did you just sit down and start writing?
I would say it was hard, and I made a lot of mistakes. And the good thing is, I had people read my drafts, and they made some suggestions. Being a scientist, one of the things I did was to I had this crazy idea. Well, I had this idea which was logical, which was, before people can understand what's going on in these stories, they really have to understand the drug industry. So I wrote a few chapters just on how the drug industry worked. And then, a couple of friends of mine, they just read them and said, just take it all out. You can't do that. People, if you're writing a thriller or a mystery, people want a thriller or a mystery, not a textbook. Mm-hmm. So that was something I definitely had to learn. And then I think I got better at mixing the important information in when necessary. There's another thing. Excuse me, I'm going to take a sip here.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't know if my avatar will take a sip.
Actually, no, we didn't provide drinks. I'm sorry. Next time.
The other thing I had to learn, because doing all the scientific writing, I wrote the King's English. And I had never written a contraction in my life. And then, of course, I had to learn you have to write the way people talk. I mean, it sounds obvious, but I had to learn that. And it took time, and I got better and better, but I had some real nice help. I started going to conferences, writers' conferences, and there's one I always like to go to. It's usually held outside Boston, up in Woburn. And it's called New England Crime Bake. And for 3 years in a row, I would submit parts of a novel or whatever, or chapters, and then you get to sit down with somebody. You pay a little money; it's minimal, and who criticizes it and critiques it, and that really helped a lot. There's, there are other things I learned. I mean, I don't know how much you want to get into.
Go right ahead, please.
Writing, but
no, please do.
Yeah, I write a lot of dialogue, and I would have long, long strips of dialogue, and this guy Stephen Roberts, who was one of the guys at Crime Bake, who helped me out, he taught me the concept of beats, which is something I had never heard before. I read books on writing, but I'd never heard of this. And what it is sort of in the middle of, if you have a long list of, if you have a long dialogue, you have to break it up, and you could just break it up with something like, Uncle Carmine leaned over and put his hand on Jimmy's knee and sighed. It's incredible how much of a difference that makes in the middle of dialogue. So I had to learn those things. Putting the whole thing together. I'd already published like 50 scientific papers. I was organized and could write and could proofread and do all that other stuff. I had other people do editing for me, but so that wasn't too hard once I focused on finishing something. So.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, very helpful. And many of the people who watch our broadcast are writers who are starting out themselves, and many of our guests who are on the show talk about the conferences that they go to. Unfortunately, we can't have them in real life now. Many of them are taking place virtually through Zoom and other types of video sessions. But to go to these conferences, to meet writers who have published, meet coaches, to attend the sessions on, for example, dialogue writing that Bill just mentioned here, are great aids to people who are just starting out. And you can take advantage of many people who have been doing this and made a few mistakes along the way, and it'll help you with your own writing. Bill, my next question for you is, the title of your first book, and forgive me because I'm probably going to murder this, Compound Release, well, to an Irish kid like me from Brooklyn, it's very intriguing. And could you tell us more about it? Because I found that concept that you wrote about in the book jacket fascinating.
Sure. Well, Campanellismo is it's an Italian philosophy of life, and it says that everything important that happens in your life occurs within the sight of the bell tower of your town. In Italian, the bell tower is the campanile. So it might also be called provincialism. You might call it provincialism, but the idea is that people act in the best interests of themselves and their relatives and close friends. That's sort of the idea. And this has a lot to do with Italian history in a way, which I'm sort of an Italian history buff. people in Italy, Italy only became a country really in the 1860s or around then. And before then, it was just all these little fiefdoms and little towns, and people were proud of their town and cared about their town, particularly in southern Italy. And they didn't do things like run off to fight the Turks. And so it's provincialism. And in this book, the main characters happen to be Italian American, and I just wanted to point out this idea that they were each working in their own self-interests only, without even thinking about it. And I also have, there are also characters in this book from Malaysia, from Kuala Lumpur, and also from the Sarawak and Borneo, which is part of Malaysia, and they're also acting in their own self-interest. So that was sort of the defining connection through the book. Now, I don't want you to get anybody to get the feeling that this book is sort of a history book or anything like that. It's a thriller. People get killed.
Good. It's a requirement to be on this show. We need body count.
Right. One time at a conference, I pitched to an agent, and she said, "Does somebody die in your first chapter? Is somebody killed in your first chapter?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, I'm not interested, but if you change it so somebody is killed in the first chapter, you can give me a call."
I've heard about how agents make requests of writers. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you said earlier, Bill, that you wrote yourself sometimes into your stories, and I'm judging it from the title and what you just told us about your love of Italian history, that we can probably find you in this first book. Is that true?
You can find a lot of stories that I've had. I think there's more of me in the second book, but you know what? You can find me in this book in the sense that one of the main characters is a PhD biologist who grew up in a working class neighborhood in the Bronx. And that kind of describes me, but it's Queens instead of the Bronx. So you can find me, but I would say not in a big way. What you'd really find is compilations of a variety of people I've known in life. And then, of course, sort of a lot of the Italian-American family stuff that I experienced. But I have to say, if you don't know, I'm half Irish.
I know, O'Neill.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm not a purebred Italian, and I'm American through and through. So.
That's good. That's good. Now, growing up in Brooklyn, I had many Italian friends. I had many friends who have, Italian-Irish heritage, just like yourself. Although I have to say that whenever somebody announced that they were marrying somebody from the other team, it always made for an interesting wedding. But
well, my mother and father did that in 1948. And my father lived on the west side of Manhattan in a completely Italian neighborhood, the 10th Avenue and 40th Street.
Know it.
And basically the apartment buildings were all filled with his relatives from this town of Guaglietta in southern Italy. And I know he's the only member of his family who married outside the Italian ethnic group.
For those people in the audience, as Bill and I are tripping down memory lane here for the good old days back in Brooklyn and Queens, neighborhoods were very ethnically segregated in those days. Irish, Italian, Jewish, you get on the list. And back in the day, for somebody to marry from Irish to Italian or Italian to Irish, just to give you a little story, if I can, family friend, he was a New York City cop. We went to a wedding where Irish, Italian, both sides of the family were in the police force. Both sides of the family came to the wedding carrying their service revolvers, as police in New York City always did back in the day. And he said, "Con, you're standing there on one side of the reception hall. You had one family. glaring at the other side of the reception hall where the other family was. And, I got so nervous because they were all drinking and they were all carrying. So that was kind of what we grew up in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I won't use the ethnic slurs, but in my neighborhood, there were both Irish kids and Italian kids, and we would have football games, and it would be the Italian kids versus the Irish kids. But
Yep.
But the titles of the teams would not be politically correct today.
Yep. Oh, and also for those of you who thought that we lived in a constant state of internecine warfare, if you came in from outside the neighborhood and you bothered one of the other kids, whether he was Irish or Italian, you were in trouble. So we stuck together. Okay, well, let's start talk a little bit more about about mystery writers. Otherwise, we won't lose half our audience as much as Bill and I are enjoying this. Joe, can we start talking maybe about some of your favorite mystery writers? Who do you enjoy reading? Who's been inspirational to you?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, I mean, I will say that I've read all the so-called greats. I've read books by Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, Elmore Leonard, Parnell Hall, who just died last week, unfortunately. William Kent Kruger. I've read all of those, and I'm sure a lot of it's sort of in the back of my head. And in the pandemic world now, I read a lot, but I'll point out that I'm a member of a group called the Wolf Pack. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No, I'm not.
No, it's we meet in New York City, but there are what are called racemes all throughout the United States, and it's a literary discussion group, or more exactly, a fan club of Rex Stout's Nero Wolfe books.
Ah, okay.
And I don't know if you've read any of those books, but I love them. They're pure escapism, but they're complex enough that you have to pay attention. So in this group, the Wolf Pack, we used to meet over dinner in New York City, and now we meet monthly by Zoom, and we always discuss one of the 72 Nero Wolfe novels and novellas. So I have to say, my flat-out favorite is Rex Stout. Yeah, I also belong to Sherlock Holmes discussion groups, which meet monthly. One of them meets monthly, so we read one of those stories every month. And I subscribe to, I read a lot now because I have a lot of time. I subscribe to Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, Sherlock Holmes Mystery Magazine, and I basically read a lot of short stories. What I will say is, in terms of reading novels, I said I read Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and all those. Now what I tend to do, if I'm going to read a mystery novel, I tend to pick out one by somebody I know personally in mystery through the Mystery Writers of America, and I get a real kick out of that. One I really liked recently was one called "When It's Time for Leaving" by a guy named Ange Pompano from Connecticut, and so I tend to do a lot of that.
Good. You've hit on many of the big names there, and I haven't read any of Rick Stout's books yet, although he is in my to-be-read pile, and I'm hoping I live long enough to dent it. But
I will say, like in pandemic world, I read a lot, and some of it's sort of to give me an excuse not to write, but I still read scientific journals and things like that, so I'm still sort of one part of my brain is still in the scientific world, and then I've been reading a lot of other authors that aren't mystery authors too. So
yeah, well, it sounds like you're very well versed in different types of literature, which is a good thing. I think sometimes we can become very focused. Occasionally you'll meet somebody who will only read one very narrow genre, and while there are many good authors there, I think we lose something when we don't start looking beyond one particular type or one particular author. With all the reading that you do and your life experiences, Bill, the characters that are in your books, where do they come from? Are they mainly from your life? Are they maybe composites from the books that you read, or somewhere else?
Well, that's interesting. Composites from the books I read. That's an interesting idea. That you never know. But a lot of these people, well, there are composites of people I've known and people I've just sort of experienced in various places. You know, I think I mentioned I worked in a truck warehouse where people stole stuff all the time. Well, just for an example, my friend's father got me that job, and he was the guy who worked down on the docks, and he was basically a small-time hood, and we worked from maybe, well, it was a night job. We worked from like 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. Loading and unloading trucks, and you know, every night, this guy, my friend's father, and his brother-in-law would pay off the guard, and they would load their cars up with whatever they deemed to be the most valuable thing that was fencible. Every night. Even, you know, one time they borrowed my car and left me a case of radios in the trunk, you know. So you know, I knew people like this, and it just gave me some ideas, and you know, I knew what they were like. And you know, we haven't really talked about what goes on in my books, but it gave me the idea in my second book, Too Many Hats, to have this situation where some low-class truck thieves hijacked a tractor trailer full of prescription medicines. You know, I was thinking about this. It actually had happened in an Eli Lilly truck had been hijacked, and then I realized, well, these characters, they wouldn't know how to fence this stuff. So how would they fence this stuff? So I thought, well, this makes for an interesting story. So I mean, I know you asked me about the where my characters come from. They're not necessarily people specific people I know, but they're the kinds of things, they do things that people I knew might do. So that's probably the closest I can come to this. And of course, you know, any scientists I write about, they're a composite of me and other people I know from science. Yeah.
Good. Before we move on, I mean, we've been kind of walking around your books here, and I don't want to have any spoilers here on the show, and I do want to point out to our audience and to our listeners that both your books are, you know, great stories, drawing on your experiences both in real life and, you know, what you've encountered through your readings. Anything else you'd like to say about either of these books before we move on to some of the broader questions?
Well, yeah, sure. You know, to give you a flavor for what they are, Campanellismo. It's about two men who are very different, even though they have similar ethnic and family backgrounds. Well, one of them's from a New Jersey. I'm not giving away the whole story here. Mm-hmm. But one of them's from a New Jersey mafia family, and he's educated and smart. But he joined the family business after college, which was truck hijacking. And then he leaves the trucking business and opens up a very profitable internet pharmacy, which sells medicines illegally online. And when I was at Pfizer, I was involved in tracking down some of this stuff. So, you know, I was familiar with this stuff. And then the other main character is an Italian-American who I mentioned from the Bronx, the PhD in biology. And these two guys end up interacting in good ways and in very bad ways. And basically, I'll just say the mafia guy, he ends up messing up clinical trials in Asia in order to get an advantage selling his generic drugs. So that's sort of it. And like I said before, people get killed.
Like I said, it's a requirement to be on the show.
Yeah. And then, you know, Too Many Hats is very different. It happens to be the same characters, but in Too Many Hats, these two guys, they've moved on. 10 years later, they're running a biotech research company in New Jersey, and they're very successful. the CEO, who's the guy who comes from the mafia family, he's an honest pillar of the community at this point, and his business partner is the director of research, and they're on top of the biotech world. They figured out how to use DNA sequencing of cancer patients to identify which drugs might be beneficial for them. But what's really interesting in stories is not sort of the background so much, but these guys really have flaws, and they both get involved in extracurricular activities that are self-destructive. And just to give you an idea of how it sort of proceeds, the CEO, who's the ex-mafia guy, he gets drawn back into running the New York Mafia's legitimate businesses. And that's actually a legit job, with MBAs reporting to him, and the mafia, with all this money, they do have a lot of legit businesses. And at the same time, the other guy, he becomes obsessed with herbal remedy con men. This became an obsession of mine, so I'm definitely in this book. I used to drive around on weekends listening to AM radio from New York, and there were these endless infomercials about herbal remedies and with outrageous claims for what they would do. I was amazed that you could get away with this. But anyway, so this research director, he starts a blog, and it becomes a very widely read blog aimed at exposing herbal remedy con men. So what happens, unfortunately, the New York mob owns some not so honest herbal remedy companies. So the two partners find themselves on opposite sides of a messy situation, and it involves, a lot of these herbal remedy companies are from Utah. It involves a senator. It ends up involving a senator from Utah, and the FDA, and people get killed.
Sounds like quite a story, and certainly they're on my to-be read list. Rather, I plan on going back and reading them cover to cover more thoroughly than I have getting ready for the show. But for the audience out there, these sound like two fascinating books. And myself, I was in the drug industry before I do what I do now, and it's certainly a very interesting industry. And some of the points that Bill was making out here. As we all know, the vaccine is being distributed in the United States, and I saw these UPS and FedEx trucks being driven out of the warehouses on TV, and the reporter said, and yes, they've got federal marshals with them to escort them to where they're going. So a lot of what Bill's talking about is happening in real life. And with that, Bill, I want to segue into a bigger topic here for the evening, and I was excited to have you on the show tonight. One, for your books, for your background, especially in this time of the pandemic and multiple vaccines coming out. How has the pandemic affected your professional career as a writer, your book promotions? What's the effect been?
Well, first of all, I'll preface it by saying everybody's different and everybody does things differently. The way I promoted my books was, first of all, I have a very large email list, and I also have, in 27 years in the drug industry, I met a lot of people in the drug industry, and I have about 2,500 contacts in LinkedIn. So I basically have had a strong push in advertising my books or publicizing my books via LinkedIn and via my email list, and we can talk in a little more detail about how I deal with that. Too Many Hats was in the new book section of Skeptical Inquirer magazine. That's so I do things like that. So, and I'm personally not interested. It sounds antisocial, and I'm not an antisocial person. I'm just not interested in sitting in bookstores signing books. In other words, I know a lot of people who go to wherever they can sit for a few hours, and I go into our local bookstore, and sometimes I feel sorry for the author who's sitting there, because nobody's going over to talk to him. I don't consider it very productive.
Yeah, actually, for the beginning writers in the audience who are listening here, what Bill is talking about is very important, because this is a big discussion point among starting out authors who I've met. Whether it's worthwhile to go out there and hit the bookstores, I've met many authors who have told me, just as Bill has done, they go out there and maybe they'll get 3 people showing up at the bookstore. They'll go to libraries for readings. They'll get another 2 or 3. Then you get other people who, for whatever reason, they seem to do better. They'll get, several dozen showing up. But this is something that any writer starting out really has to take a long, hard look at and see what works and what doesn't work for them. And as Bill said, you're going to be spending a lot of time on the road, going to a lot of places where, if you're lucky, you're going to be getting a cup of lukewarm coffee. But Bill, you also said something I'd like to explore a little bit further, because I find this to be, with many of my clients, an interesting point. You said that you utilized your email list and your LinkedIn list from your career. Now, just a quick aside here for the audience. Most writers these days, like Bill, have day jobs. The idea of the writer, starving writer in an attic someplace, whirling away, there's not too many of them left. I think they starved to death a while back. Most writers have careers. They're on LinkedIn, which is the professional social media, social networking tool. And they have large communities. And many of them don't stop to think that they could sell their books to their communities, like Bill has done. And I congratulate you for doing that, because I hate to tell you how much time I spent talking to people about, well, why don't we go talk to your friends, the people you worked with, because they'd love to buy your books. But please, could you talk a little bit more about using LinkedIn and email, because this is important for the writers in the audience.
Sure. I tend to think of my use of LinkedIn as being atypical, and I don't know if it's atypical, but I've taken advantage of the fact that I've met a whole lot of people. I used to give a lot of talks at scientific congresses and things like that. A lot of people know me. And my books both have the pharmaceutical industry as background. So having all these LinkedIn contacts in the pharmaceutical industry, it was a quite productive way to sell books. Now, from my perspective, I like money as much as the next guy, but I'm not doing this for money. But I do want to sell a lot of books, because my whole purpose in doing this is to entertain people. That's the way I look at it. And you don't want to entertain nobody. You want to entertain as many people as possible. So the LinkedIn worked for me because I was from the pharmaceutical industry, and the books were against the background of the pharmaceutical industry. And I let people know that when I let them know through LinkedIn. The email list, again, overlaps with the LinkedIn list. And I've been trying to use that in a slightly different way. Of course, first of all, I've only launched 2 books, but in both times I sent messages out to everybody on my email list, and I try to make it a little funny, and I just try to engage them, because they're people I have had real contact with at various times. But the other thing I've started doing recently, I did this before publishing Too Many Hats. We haven't talked about this, and it's sort of another side topic. I write little quirky science-related pieces for Sherlock Holmes Mystery Magazine.
Yes.
And they're on funny topics. They're on toxicity of quail in various parts of the world at various times, or how the poison ricin works that was used to attack Georgy Markov, and a Bulgarian dissident in London. Or I did one on man-eating plants, and I have a couple in press on trials by ordeal, and I try to relate these things to Sherlock Holmes stories. Anyway, they're very short, and once they're published, I have the rights to them. So what I do is, every time I publish one of those, I send it for free to everybody on my email list. And what I try to do with the email list, which is, I know from my engineering background, this is really silly, but I don't do it efficiently. What I try to do is I try to group people in the email list who know each other, and or have known each other at various times. And what I find is the story sometimes precipitates a discussion in that subgroup of the email list. So that's what I'm trying to do. Now, I will be the first one to admit I haven't yet found the combination of approaches that takes me past the tipping point to wide recognition and sales. And when I can sit down over a drink with other people from Mystery Writers of America, for example, or with other writers at conferences, I'm in good company.
That you are. There's, in my experience working with writers, what we're seeing in terms of how books are sold, the impact of technology, has really affected book sales. Many of the leading writers today that we all look up to, they got their start really before Amazon and the internet took off. Kind of coincided with the big box stores, Barnes & Noble, Borders, when those monsters used to rule the land. And it's a very different game out there now. Trying to get an agent is becoming increasingly harder. Recently the acquisition of Simon & Schuster by Random House Penguin. The big five are now the big four, and that consolidation will probably only continue as we go forward. For writers out there now, it's a very different ballgame, and I think that we're going to see this change and consolidation continue for a while yet. Ebooks are having effect. Independent bookstores almost went out of business a couple of years ago. They had a slight resurgence before the pandemic set in, but we're still trying to figure out if the pandemic has set them back or if they're going to flourish in spite of it. But it's a tough time for a writer out there. But the world still demands good books, good writing. So I think we're going to, writers will have to adapt as they go forward.
Yeah, I'll tell you another couple of things I did, which, if there are writers or budding writers in the audience, you can invest a little money sometimes. It's very important to get reviews. And the more reviews you get on Amazon, the more your book will come up higher in ranking and things like that. So one of the things I do is certainly when I send out an email announcement when I launch a novel, I always ask that the people consider writing a very brief 1 or 2 sentence Amazon review, whether they like the book or not. And the good thing about Amazon is how many books you're selling.
Yes.
And my experience, I think I've been pretty lucky, but about 1 in 10 book purchasers do it. If I've asked them to do it. So I don't know how good that is, but I'll tell you another thing I discovered. I was at a conference at the bar, which is where you always learn things. And I was sitting next to a guy. We started talking, and he's a person who helps with publicity. He was from Colorado somewhere, and he told me about these things, and I tried it. First of all, one thing nice about having your Kindle on Amazon, your Kindle book on Amazon, is that you can run discounted days and you can run free days. Now, nobody wants to make zero money, but you do want advertising, so you have to give something in order to get something. And what this guy told me about was there are these online book clubs and book sites. And here's a few of them. Well, here are a few of them: E-Reader News, Free Booksy, Book Adrenaline, Book Gorilla, Fussy Librarian. And I tried with too many hats to, what I did was I paid each of them, and it's about $50 a piece. I think I spent $240. I paid each of them to post my book as the book of the day for free. Like their people, their customers or their readers like to get free books. Free ebooks. So I ran a free ebook program for Too Many Hats for 5 days, and I tried each of these 5 different book clubs on each day, and I got 4,900 free downloads. Now people joke with me and say, well, those might be strange guys sitting in their parents' in the bedroom, their parents in the bedroom, their bedroom in their parents' house in their underwear, who just download everything they can for free. I don't know. But there were 4,900 free downloads. But I didn't make any money directly, obviously, but 5,000 people know who I am. But the funny thing is, on Goodreads, you might be familiar with Goodreads.
Yes, I am. Yes.
I got 25 to 30 reviews on Goodreads. Well, I guess the way I could look at it was, by doing what I did, I paid for these reviews, but these people wouldn't have read my book or reviewed it otherwise.
Right. And just for everybody in the audience, Goodreads is an online reading community. And for anybody who's a serious reader or a serious writer, I would recommend that you join. It's free. For a writer, it's an opportunity to promote your books, to get reviews. The nice thing about Goodreads is people are there because they like books, they read books, and they can identify which genre they want. One of the problems with Facebook is, yes, you can get very specific about targeting your audience. Unfortunately, you don't have those people read books. Goodreads, you've got a pretty good chance that they read books. If they're going to the trouble of setting up an account and following others, they read books. So also, for people like Bill, who write multiple books, while it may sound at first pass a little silly to offer the books for free, writers have what they call backlist, the books they published already. If you have a new book coming out, first book you can offer for free or at a discount, people will read it, and odds are they will pick up the next book, or pick up the one that's going to be published, or even better, pick up the book and leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads for you. So there is a method to the madness that Bill is describing here.
Now it works best for people who publish a book a year.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's still a good strategy. Now, Bill, we're starting to run out of time, but I do want to get back to a couple of critical issues for you. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this question, given your background. How do you see the pandemic playing out in 2021, from just a general population point of view, with vaccines being distributed and new vaccines coming onto the market?
Okay, I'm not an expert, but like everybody, I have an opinion. And I'll say, back in March of 2020, when things really started to look bad, and certainly into April, people didn't believe me when I said, I'll see you in 2022. And I think, unfortunately, that's the way it's sort of turning out. Now, everybody's different. I tend to be a little bit hermit-like right now because of medical issues, but and a lot of people are out in the world, and I have a lot of friends who are out in the world. The vaccine, first of all, the success of these vaccines with 95% efficacy is just incredible. These messenger RNA vaccines, it's just incredible. It's like a dream come true. And I think people like me will probably get vaccinated in March or something like that. But maybe it could be by September, everybody who wants the vaccine will get it. But unfortunately, I don't see how that changes all of our lives that much. And even now, I mean, anybody who just reads the newspaper knows some of these things. It's still unknown whether the vaccine will prevent you from giving somebody else COVID. You may not get sick from it. You may become you may have no symptoms, but you might still be shedding virus to other people. Excuse me. So this idea of achieving, well, then the other thing, of course, is there's a cadre of people who just won't take vaccines, and they won't take the vaccine. Here's a little pet peeve of mine, since you brought this up.
Yes.
I really dislike how some of the media are jumping on every example of a side effect as if it's a major thing, and having worked on clinical trials for 2 decades, I know that these things happen all the time, and they get investigated, and either they're drug related or not drug related. But but they usually are unimportant. And here's an example I saw today, which was unbelievable. It was on, actually, it was caught by USA Today fact checking. There was a nurse in Chattanooga, in Tennessee. I won't say, I don't know what city, but the local news people were filming her getting her vaccine. And then about 10 minutes after she got the vaccine, she collapsed. And then they made a big deal about it. And what happened was it went viral. I mean, I don't know if you've seen it, but
I haven't.
This news clip went viral. And it turns out that this nurse has a vagal, what's called a vagal problem. In layman's terms, she faints a lot. And she faints when she's anxious, and she faints when she has pain, and she often faints when she has injections. And she actually said, when interviewed later, that she actually had fainted pretty much, she said, once a week for the last 6 weeks in various situations. But the video went viral. So what this does is it creates doubt in people's minds about the safety of the vaccine, and then people like to say, well, they were pushed forward too quickly and all of this. So it seems to me like there are a number of people who just like to write man bites dog stories. And right now, side effects of the vaccine is man bites dog. Anyway,
I'm glad you brought that up, because I like to tell people when they raise that point where there are side effects. You go into any given school in this country today, you hand out bags of peanuts to all the children. One child will probably have an allergic reaction to peanuts. We don't stop peanuts. It's unfortunate, and I think the drug companies and the agencies do a pretty thorough job of screening these drugs for things that would be obvious showstoppers. But unfortunately, given we're talking about what 360 million people in the United States today, 4 billion people. There's bound to be some kind of reaction, or in the case of this poor nurse, there's a condition that she got nationwide TV staring at her while she's getting a shot in the arm. Yeah, I'd be nervous too, and would probably pass out. So, yeah.
So I won't ramble on, but I just want to summarize, since you asked about it. I think by January of 2022, we might be back to normal. And I might be back in the New York City subway going to my Mystery Writers of America conferences and meetings to see you. But I don't think I don't think it's going to happen before then. That's sort of how I'm looking at it.
Yeah. No, I'm kind of with you there. I mean, the great influenza of 1918 took about 3 years to burn through society, and that's without vaccines or modern medicine or science. So I don't think we can expect to do much better than that. And if it does last to January 22, that's about 2 years. So I think we're pretty lucky if it is. Last question for the night for you, Bill. Then I'm going to start asking people in the audience for questions. You've written 2 great books. You got a great career. Can we expect more?
Okay, I'll just say, COVID time, I've gotten lazy. I have a harder time getting motivated because I got into this daily routine that's focused on arranging grocery delivery, curbside pickup, planning and cooking meals, the treadmill, reading books, and reading more books. But I will say, I've started a series of stories and novellas that feature sort of the traditional pair of amateur sleuths. And one of them is the chauffeur for a Columbia professor who's a poison expert. The chauffeur isn't a poison expert, but the professor is. And then the other in the pair is a curvaceous Italian-American lady embalmer.
Interesting.
So I'm working on that. I realize, when I've talked to publicity people, they said, if you have 2 books that are against the background of the pharmaceutical industry and you have people buying them, you should be writing a 3rd book sort of like that. So I am thinking about it, and I have some ideas, and the way I work is I have to sort of know what the book is about, and then I can actually write it pretty quickly. But right now I'm just doing these novellas. I have some short stories I've written that I'm revising. They have nothing to do with the pharmaceutical industry. And just as an example, I started and stopped the book against the background of baseball, which is another sort of one of my loves. But it turned out I was rewriting Moneyball in a way. So I just stopped. These are the things that end up in the bottom drawer and never go anywhere.
It happens. Okay, well, Bill, we're coming to the end of our broadcast segment. Right now, Isabel is going to be stopping the camera because she's got to go to bed. And we'll start turning it over to the audience to see if they have any questions for us. So for those of you who are dialing in from home, the live broadcast is ending now. We're going to do a brief period of questions and answer with the studio audience here for a while. Please contact me at consweeney@Someti.com if you have any suggestions for panelists, ideas for shows, or wish to participate yourself. We're learning how to put on a show like this, and it's difficult. And if you'd like to help us on the crew, we could use more people, and if we ever get enough people, maybe we can have more shows. We're working on a guest for January 2021, and we'll be announcing him soon. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you again next month. Have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Stay safe. Thank you very much. Isabel, you can end the transmission now if you like.